When you say resilience, it can mean a lot of things. For us, resilience is the opposite of being naive. It's the understanding of the reality that we live in a broken world. And so, in a broken world, bad, tragic, and awful things happen. And yet, being resilient means understanding that and yet living with hope. And a hope that surpasses the broken, bad things that happen. Welcome back to the Be Unbound podcast. I'm your co-host, Jonathan Brush.
And I'm your co-host, David Rethemeyer.
And we're delighted to be here again after a little bit of a hiatus, although we have some pretty good excuses for that. Recently, I was just at Base Camp, which is our second live event for our Ascend program. Had a really lovely time just outside of Bedford, Pennsylvania with our students there. And we had a lot of cool things happen, a lot of good stuff to talk about. Unusually so, we were without our best AV person because David was not with us in Bedford, Pennsylvania, but he had a really excellent excuse. So, David, why did you not join us at Base Camp this year, man?
I had a couple of good excuses. The primary reason is that, I'm just really trying to get used to wearing this new piece of jewelry on my left hand. It's just really weighing me down, and it was really inhibiting my ability to be able to go throughout everyday life.
There is an acclimation process for sure. So.
Absolutely. Yes. So I had just gotten married. And so we're pretty much just getting back from the honeymoon, and which was all the way out in Rome, which was absolutely phenomenal experience. And so we didn't quite have the bandwidth to immediately turn back around and come to base camp. So as much as I absolutely hate to miss an Unbound event, being able to have time to recover with my wife was a real blessing.
There is some suspicion that if we had pushed hard enough, David might actually have come, but then his new wife may not have forgiven us, and that sounded like a bad deal all the way around. So, no, that was actually, we were sorry to miss David, delighted for the reason for it. And we did include him because we did have a few AVU questions that we called from the event. We're like, hey, David, we need some help setting some stuff up. So yeah, all those things have happened. It's been a fun couple of months in the world of Unbound. And so our new Ascend class is coming along. Our high school program is clicking along. I think the last time we recorded stuff, we were still finalizing some of those classes and courses. And it's been a really good year. But coming from that, we wanted to just sort of re-enter things a little bit here. We'll have some really cool guests coming up in some soon to air episodes. But right now, we thought we might cover some of those themes from Base Camp. And David gets kind of the objective view here since he didn't hear it at Base Camp, so we can kind of get him to weigh in now. For our Ascend program, each of our events has a bit of a theme to it. We adjust that theme every year, often playing off the theme that we have at Apex that our students choose. But one of the perennial themes that we kind of try to tie things to at Base Camp is the theme of resilience. And just to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing, when you say resilience, it can mean a lot of things. For us, resilience is the opposite of being naive. It's the understanding of the reality that we live in a broken world. And so in a broken world, bad, tragic, and awful things happen. And so it's important to be not naive and to understand that. And yet, being resilient means understanding that and yet living with hope. And a hope that surpasses the broken, bad things that happen. And of course, both those things are really important. We want to acknowledge that bad things happen, but we also want to kind of lean into this idea of living with hope. And so we talk about that and we explore it each year in some slightly different ways, depending on what the Apex theme was and what we think the current needs of our students and sometimes needs of our staff as we explore these themes together. So David, one of the things that we talked about this year was we had a little bit of a focus on endurance and the long game. And so at Apex, our theme was live deliberately. And part of that was this idea that to live deliberately means to live in faith. And faith, certainly we mean in Christ, but faith in the sense that we look behind us and say, all that happened in our past perfectly put us where we are now. And some of those things are good and some of those things are bad. And some of those good things were our doing and some of those good things were beyond our control. And some of those bad things were our own doing and some of those bad things were beyond our control. It's the faith that we believe that God can redeem all of those things and ultimately work them together for some sort of good end. That good end may be very far in the future. It may be a little bit past our understanding, but we have faith that what has happened before can and will be redeemed. And we live in hope of a future that always gets better. That doesn't mean if you're sick, you're going to get better. It doesn't mean if you're weak, you're going to get stronger. It doesn't mean that if you're poor, you're going to get wealthier. It means that ultimately we believe in the redemption of all things. A new heaven, a new earth, a return of Christ that makes all things new and wipes away every tear and every sadness. And so that one way or the other, what comes ahead is better than what was behind, and that we can live deliberately in the light of those two realities. So when we get to base camp and we're talking about resilience, we talked about a quote from Eugene Peterson, which is that faith is long obedience in the same direction. And then to that, one of our staff members, Caitlin, added, so, if that's the case, then resilience is kind of long hope in the same direction. And I was thinking, well, if we're going to look for the trifecta here, then love is long commitment in the same direction. And so we talked about some of those things at base camp, but we specifically spent some time emphasizing the long part of that, so the longer term. So just before we turned on the mics here and started recording, David, you had an observation that you and your new wife were discussing along these lines. So share that a little bit with our audience, because I thought you had some cool observations.
Yeah, I think it's such a healthy thing to look at the long term, especially for our class of students who are just going into their young adulthood stage of life, to be able to look at the long game. Because I think, especially in our culture right now, although I think this has been a issue in pretty much every era of culture, it is so much more tempting and so much easier to look at the short term of whatever stage of life that we're in and think, okay, I only have a very limited window of opportunity where I get to accomplish the things that I want to accomplish, do the things that I want to do, make a meaningful difference in the world, and I'm actually capable of accomplishing and doing and being everything that I actually want to be. And after I pass that certain window, then everything just goes downhill from here, whether that's because of just more limited physical capability, or just not being able to have time to do things because you're busy with family commitments and other things like that. There's just this view that really there's a prime of your life, and that's the only time, that's like the main time where you can actually make a difference. And I think that is just completely and utterly untrue for so many reasons. What I was telling my wife is that I have just been able to see so many examples in my own life of people who are well past the prime of their life, who have made an absolutely massive difference in their community and in me, who have been able to do that, and in a lot of ways would not have been equipped to make the difference that I have seen them make if they had been in the same position that they're in now, but 20 years prior. And it's just something that we fail to look at a lot of the time, to say what we are doing right now, maybe it isn't necessarily the most world-changing thing, but it may be equipping us to do a incredibly world-changing thing later on, and it just probably is not necessarily what we might idealize. It might not be Instagram viral story worthy, but it is every bit as meaningful, and I think most importantly, it's every bit as capable of building the kingdom of God.
Well, there's some irony in those statements, David. I have the privilege and honor of having known David's wife before she was David's wife, as she's an Unbound alum, and has also done some things working for Unbound at various times. And I have often accused David's wife, Molly, of trying to, this is previously, of course, of trying to live her entire life before she was 21. And so Molly is high energy and high talent and high skill and full out in all the best aspects of that. I mean, so all that it meant as a very complimentary way. And so I remember gently joking with her a little bit, but also having some seriousness and saying, it's not necessary for you to live your entire life before 21. You might want to reserve a few of those things for after that. And I don't know that actually slowed her down to me at all. But there is this kind of interesting, there is a drive, a vigor, and excitement and energy with youth. And so we don't in any way mean that you should curtail that or slow that down. I think one of the things that I have gained some perspective on, not because I was wise at that time, David's far wiser than I was at the same age, but because looking back, I get the privilege of this 2020 hindsight. And that is that energy, that drive, all that passion is right, but it's best used in preparation. And preparation is not so much in preparation to some master plan, which is some confusion that I had, right? So like, I've got all this ability. I can't do anything, so I don't have all the right resources, experience, opportunity of those things. But also, I'm not really sure where I'm going. And so I felt like, everything would be fine if I just had a master plan and I knew where I wanted to be in 50 years. And of course, my view on that is that that's absolutely insane. I'm not particularly confident I know where I'm going to be in 6 months or a year from now, which I don't necessarily see as a bad thing. It's just a reality of the kind of world that we live in, and probably the world that we always lived in. What is unknown controls far more of our lives than what is known. What is out of our control is far more influential in our lives than what is under our control. And so there's always this aspect of there's a big gulf, a big unknown, a big void ahead that you can't really ever plan for. But instead, to throw yourself into whatever you're doing with commitment and excellence and passion and all those kinds of things, because of the thing we talked about at the beginning, which is that faith, that God redeems those things. And so I was just thinking yesterday that so many aspects of my life that I'm living now are things that I desperately desired 15 years ago, but was totally unable to achieve. When I finally achieved some of them, and it certainly wasn't all of them, but I achieved some of them, often at the moment of achievement, I look back and went, man, I was not ready for this even 3 months prior to this. In other words, there was a timing aspect that I just simply did not understand earlier. One of my favorite examples that I use a lot is that I live on a piece of property that is not particularly exciting, other than, to me, it's exciting. It's at the end of a dead-end road, which I think is cool, and it's on the middle river of the Shenandoah Valley. And I've always been fascinated with water and fascinated with moving water and love rivers. And so it's a really cool dream come true to live in that kind of aspect. It's a little bit remote, and yet it's close to things. It's an old farmhouse that comes with a lot of challenges. It's a modestly sized home, but it's bigger than what we had been in previously. So to us, it felt like a bit of a stretch. And it's a beautiful piece of property with great neighbors, a great community, and one that's a great place to live. What is interesting about that piece of property is that 26 years ago, I think I'm trying to get this right, 25 years ago, I saw it for the first time. And I saw it because the person I was working with, and at the time for, at the college where I worked, owned it. And she hosted a party for our office. And I came down and I had the strangest feeling of almost coming home. And I just was utterly fascinated with the property. And over the next several years, I became very close to the person that owned it. We were colleagues. We also attended church together. And we actually talked about us buying it at various times. It just never worked out for various reasons. And there was some disappointment in that. And I just felt a strong attachment to it. Well, it was 16 years before things worked out in such a way that we're actually able to move to the property. But at the time, we moved as renters, which was definitely not what I had wanted. And then it was, it was 4 years, almost 5 years of renting before we were able to actually purchase the property. And so we purchased it in 2020. There was not a lot of other things going on at that time. But it was interesting. The moment we signed the papers, I had this overwhelming, almost revelation that this property, which had a lot of challenges, it had a lot of challenges to the building, it had a lot of challenges to the property, there's a lot of things, I was singularly unequipped to deal with any of them even 5 years previously, let alone 10 or 15 or 20. And it would have been an utter disaster. We would have had to have sold it, or it would have, fallen down around us or something. Like we just simply could not deal with it. And yet, at the time we were able to move here and then eventually, take ownership of it, we were in just a unique position where I had children who then had some contracting and some construction experience. We had connections. We had a little more financial resources than we had previously. All of those things worked together to make it actually a usable, doable thing. And I think that, 15 years prior, 20 years prior, all I remember feeling was the hot sting of disappointment because I couldn't make work what I what I was dreaming about. And then fast forward 20 years, and there was just this feeling of utter relief that had not been fulfilled earlier. My desire had not been fulfilled earlier, since it would have turned to ashes in my mouth. And now I'm curious. I wonder about the things that I'm looking forward to now, or I'm dreaming about now, or I'm trying to achieve now, and wonder if the timing is right. So, David, you've got a little shorter spectrum. You're maybe on the front end of that preparatory curve, but yeah, do you see something similar? Or you shared earlier about you have this conviction that you have more time. How does that actually look? What's it look like practically for you right now?
Yeah. I just one thing that in note to respond to that story, which I love, is just that so many times someone much wiser than me once told me that one of God's most common answers to prayer is not yet. And just the truth of that I have heard through your story that you just shared, and so many stories of people with many years under their belt that have said that we've prayed for this thing for, 10, 15, 20, even 30 years, and it didn't happen until then, just because God's answer to prayer seemed at the time to be no, was actually not yet. And it's such an encouraging thing to know that just a lot of the time God is not ignoring our prayers, but it's just saying, hold on, my timing is better. And that's an encouraging thing to hold on to. And I think something that has been really helpful for me as I have considered what it looks like to just gain perspective and look for the long term in my life. One of my best friends, my best man in my wedding, he's given me a couple of tools that have really helped me in not being anxious about like making sure that I maximize every possible thing in the present and that all I have is just the next few years ahead of me. One of those things is that he told me once is when I was just really anxious about a decision that was coming up and something that was a more temporary problem. And he asked, is this going to matter in 5 years? Like, is this thing going to actually be on your mind? Is this going to be something that you're going to look back and go like, yeah, that was really a significant concern 5 years from now? Is this actually going to matter? And that really put things into perspective and helped me to understand that that doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't matter right now, but it helps me to understand actually in the grand scheme of things, when I'm just caught up in whatever specific circumstance that I'm looking at right now and thinking, what will happen if I miss this opportunity? 5 years from now, is my life going to look dramatically different if I miss this opportunity? Probably not most of the time. In some circumstances, maybe, but a lot of the time it's not. And so that was one perspective that really helped me. The other one that he gave that I go back to on a very consistent basis is he told me that once that a lot of the time, if we find ourselves really anxious about something, we can trace it back to it being an answer to prayer if we look back far enough, kind of talking about the faith aspect. So for example, like if I'm really stressed about something in my work and I have like a lot of anxiousness about something that I'm working on, if I actually trace it back, it's like, wait a minute, I have a job that I prayed for many years. I was praying for a good job that I would be able to enjoy with people that I enjoyed working with, that would be flexible, all of that. And like, I'm stressed about this one element, but if I look at it in the grand scheme of things, this is something that I prayed for back in the day. And so kind of zooming out and realizing that it can be helpful. Or for example, if, I'm stressed about something with like my relationship with my wife, then I can zoom out and look back. It's like, I've been praying for an amazing wife that I can share life with and be a life partner with for so many years. And the fact that I now get to work through this tiny little thing is actually ultimately a blessing because I have an amazing wife who I get to work through these things with. And so both of those things came to mind as ways that at least this specific friend and other friends have encouraged me in so many other ways to really just have that long perspective and just to zoom out from whatever is a stress, anxiety inducing thing that happens in the moment and to realize that there is so much of a greater context that can allow us to be so blessed if we can just zoom out and see it.
Well, I think that's a cool perspective in a lot of ways. And the not yet is so important. I mean, that might be one of the biggest lessons of my life. My spiritual lessons of my life is the not yet. Now, I have a story, and, it happened when not that long ago, we were getting ready to go on vacation, and it was turning into an absolute nightmare because we were having a really hard time trying to find a kennel for the dog. And then it was even worse because when my wife took the dog to be kenneled, she literally came back and said, I think I just took the dog to doggy concentration camp. And so the dog lives with us in the house with all these kids on this like dead end road by the river. And she was dragging to this place with this kennel and all these dogs like coming out and barking at it. The dog was scared and terrified. And I'm sitting there going, how is it that we are supposed to be on vacation and my wife is a basket case over a stupid dog? But if you go back, there's a really interesting story to all of that because I grew up with a lot of animals in our house. We had, all kinds of pets, and we lived on a farm, and there were cattle, and at times we had horses. I mean, just all this kind of stuff. But my parents were particularly into dogs, and so we had a lot of dogs, and sometimes we had as many as 3 Labrador Retrievers all at the same time. We lived in a very small house at a dead-end country road, so that kind of gives you some linkage there. And it was kind of total chaos, and I just thought that was normal. So, David, I'm a newlywed, right? And we had talked about a lot of things. We hadn't talked about the dogs. And so it didn't matter because we were moving into an apartment that didn't allow pets.
Hmm.
And so we moved to the apartment and, we get through the early parts of marriage. Everything's awesome. And so I'm checking out books in the library about dogs. And Kara's like, why would we look at dogs? We're not going to live in an apartment forever. And I'm going to, sometime we're going to own a dog. And she's like, well, that's fine. But, we don't do dogs inside. And I was like, what? We don't do dogs inside. Like we never talked about this, right? I mean, like dogs. And so she had grown up with a dog too, but the dog lived outside. Well, that was very different.
Hmm.
So back and forth. So then I spent years researching dogs that like didn't shed and, all these kinds of things. So I did all this research. And so then we moved and we buy a house and now we can have dogs. And she's like, look, as long as I'm changing diapers, I don't really feel like I've got time to house train a pet. And I thought, that seems like some unassailable moral high ground. Like that makes a lot of sense to me, right?
Hmm.
What I didn't know was that we were going to change diapers for 20 years, right? So that I had no idea that was going to be such a long commitment. And so no dog, no dog. And finally I get to the point that, dogs didn't really matter. And so just to be clear, this was never a point of contention in our marriage. It was some friendly joking back and forth. Never became really real. And when it did, I didn't really care that much about it. So it was a kind of a funny banter, but also it was like one of those things in my life. I was like, well, maybe when I retire, I'll get a dog, right? And so we get to 2020. Of course, everything's locked down and all this stuff's going on. And a person who works for us in Unbound now breeds dogs. And so Kara's interested. She gets interested in this dog. It's a little puppy. Well, little puppy comes and, like anything else that's small and helpless that comes to our house, it never leaves if Kara has her hands on it. So the dog was definitely inside dog. And my wife it was her choice. And I was thinking, wow, what a cool thing, God. I mean, like, we got the dog now. I didn't have to argue my way into it. It's Kara's choice, and the dog's a big part of the family now. Well, not part of the family, but it's cool and all this kind of stuff. And then we had this incident where Kara's taking this dog and freaking out about it. And here's where I had this really interesting revelation. We had traveled with the company that was a predecessor to Unbound for 7 years, and during those 7 years, we were on the road almost constantly. When I say we, my entire family traveled. And there were some springs when we were only home between February and June, maybe 2 or 3 weekends in that whole time. And all of a sudden, I just had this blinding realization. I thought, if we had a dog, there was no way Kara would have left that dog for that kind of stretch. She would have said part of the responsibility was she had to stay home and take care of that dog. And if there's no way I would have spent 7 years on the road by myself, I would have just got another job. I mean, that wouldn't have been an acceptable way to raise a family or to be there for it. And I just had this kind of thunderbolt moment as I was just walking down the river, and I was like, oh my word, all the things that are really big in our life right now, Unbound and what we do with Unbound, all that kind of stuff, that may not have been possible because I would have left if we had done what I wanted to do, and we'd have gotten the dog back then. And by God's great mercy, the dog came, we got it still, right? But it came not only in a way that was pleasant and worked for us in terms of Kara's interest in having it and all those kinds of things, but at just the right timing in our life when taking care of it made sense and didn't interfere with a bunch of other things. And of course, the blessings that we have from Unbound far exceed anything that you would ever get from a pet. And I just had this kind of blinding moment that I was like, wow, that I never would have thought of that. I never would have seen that. That was certainly, what we do with Unbound wasn't even an inkling or a desire or even the slightest bit of a dream on my horizon. Like I wasn't thinking about that at all. And yet something that far exceeded anything that too big for me to even dream happened, and it would have all been sabotaged if I had my way. Now fortunately it's a happy story in the sense there was no fighting about it, there was no tension about it, but it was just this kind of interesting thing. And again, David, I had this kind of, wow, I wonder what else insignificant is going on in my life right now that God's saying not yet. And maybe even just these little things, I'm kind of like, oh, I really wish we had blank. And I wonder if there's a smile somewhere saying, you don't have any idea, just wait and see. And it really has had an impact on my life. There is an element of, I still feel like I've got a drive to do things and ambition, all those kinds of things. But there is definitely an open-handedness and a patience that absolutely was totally unobtainable by me in my 30s or earlier that now makes life a lot more fun. It's like, yeah, I'll try and strive for this. And if it doesn't work, that's fine. I trust the timing, and we'll either keep working at it to see what does work or do something else and trust that it'll come around or it won't. And that will be in hands larger and wiser than my own. Yeah. So it just is it's an interesting. Every time I start thinking about something, I was like, yeah, look at the dog there and think about the timing of that.
Yeah, it's cool to hear that and just hear how God just works out all of these things, even from relatively little things like having a dog that ultimately would have dramatically ended up changing the course of how you guys were able to end up living your lives. And the fact that it would have something that was so seemingly inconsequential, but ended up making a really big difference. And yeah, I think it's cool. And I think it's worth noting too here that it's something that God often does provide those things. And often I think that there are a lot of circumstances that we can look back on where we can look back at some of those things that we're just like, man, I really, really want to have this particular thing. And God says, ultimately, actually does say no to those things. And looking back on it, we can go and say, yeah, I'm glad that he said no on those things. For example, when I also, 2020 story, funny enough, I was finishing up grad school. I was finishing up my master's in business administration. And I was interviewing with a bunch of Fortune 500 companies thinking that I was going to get a job in one of their business departments and I was going to climb my way up the corporate ladder and make a lot of money and make a lot of connections that way. And the way that I was going to impact the kingdom of God was by being a business mogul. And so I was in final round interviews for a couple of those companies when lockdowns completely just shut down the nation, and every single one of those businesses, no matter how good they thought any of their applicants were, decided, you know what, we really just do not want to hire anybody at this point. And so at the moment, I was extremely demoralized and thought that I was just going to have to work really hard and was not going to be able to ultimately accomplish what I thought that I had been purposed to do. But it turns out that after a while, that ended up leading me here to Unbound, which has been a tremendous blessing to my life. And in so many ways, not only because it's a job that I love, but I don't think that I would have ultimately gotten together with my wife if it hadn't been for that. And looking back, even I got to hear from some of my classmates who a couple of years later did get into those companies, and just hearing them talk about their experiences, I sat there and went, I think I would have been miserable at the end of the day there. I think that I would have just been completely demoralized by the environment that I would have been in. Sure, I would have been making more money, but I would have been in a really, really dark place. And I'm incredibly grateful that that was something that God said no to. And being able to look back in that long view and say, hey, I'm glad that God said no to that. There's probably quite a few things now that I'm praying for that God may say no to, that at the end of the day, I'm probably going to be pretty grateful for in the long scheme of things. And so even though those no's can be disappointing in the moment, it's encouraging to know that he still works through and has a perfect plan for those no's as well.
That's a great observation. I don't want to get the wrong theological twist in this, so everybody listen carefully. But there are things that God says no to and that are hard, right? And we're not talking, but we're not talking about tragedy or crisis here so much as kind of, there's opportunity here and there's opportunity there. God says no to one, you end up going to another one that maybe feels lesser, maybe feels different or something like that. So many times in my life, that has turned out to be God saying a bigger yes. And for somebody who cared a lot about the future and dreamed about the future and thought about it a lot, I've been utterly surprised by, first of all, how many of the things I dreamed about have come about, but not in any ways that I would have ever thought about. And the second thing is that how many things have happened that were far beyond anything that I had the capacity to imagine. In other words, there are so many things in my life that are huge aspects of my life that are treasured parts of my life that I just simply did not have any concept of being able to imagine before. And so it surpassed even my own imagination. Well, thank you all for letting us reflect a little bit on Basecamp and some of the themes there and catch up a little here as David returns with some new hardware on his left hand. If you are interested in some of the things we talk about and interested about things like Basecamp and all those things, go to beunbound.us. If you are interested in Ascend, our recruiting year has started. As we tell people all the time, the way Ascend works for us from both a business aspect and a cash flow aspect is that our lowest prices on Ascend always happen at the early part of the year. So right now, to enroll in Ascend for next year, this is the least amount you're ever going to be able to enroll for, as it goes up throughout the rest of the year, which is just a function of the kind of business model we have to run because of the nature of when recruits come in. Also, if you go to beunbound.us, you can learn more about Voyage, our new course about finding work that you love. Navigate enrollment is going to open fairly soon, as well as our high school enrollment for our Equip and Declare programs and Explore programs. And you can find information for all of those things at beunbound.us. Thanks for joining us. David, any final last words of wisdom before we wrap up this segment?
I would just say enjoy the moment that God has given you and look forward to all of the yeses, nos, and not yets that He has for you. And in conclusion, as always, be unbound.